your Bibles to Jeremiah chapter 23. Jeremiah chapter 23. And we're going to stay in this particular chapter for all this morning. I think I announced last Sunday that we would just do one chapter today. So Jeremiah chapter 23. There's about 40 verses, I think, or so that we'll need to look at together and today as we continue our study of this book of Jeremiah. And the writer of the worksheets that we've been using kind of gives the caption of a brighter future. Because there is kind of a conversation at the beginning of this chapter about why they're in the predicament they're in, but he does then come around and begin to talk about the remnant and the benefits that would eventually come. There's an amazing approach that God has sometimes, and that's actually our sermon this morning, so I don't want to preach it yet. But how God offers glimmers of hope even in the midst of judgment. Even in the midst of where God is bringing warning and telling folks to be careful of what's coming and the doom that might be ahead of them. But in the same breath, he might also talk about the fact that here's this benefit and this wonderful opportunity to be restored at a given point in the future. And so that's where we'll find ourselves together in our study of the book of Jeremiah this morning. In the beginning of the chapter, he mentions the fact that he gives a warning to whom? Or a woe to them. Woe unto the shepherds, right? Because what had they done? Okay, in the early part of the chapter, and we'll see about the lying and the other things they had done as well, but they had destroyed and scattered the sheep of my pasture, saith Jehovah. And therefore, thus saith Jehovah, the God of Israel, against the shepherds that feed my people, you have scattered my flock and driven them away, and have not visited them. Behold, I will visit upon you the evil of your doings, saith Jehovah. And so, here's this, sadness of the reality of the fact that all that nation that should have been honoring and worshiping and behaving themselves in their relationship and covenant with God had been led astray by whom? Their leaders. How important is good leadership? According to God. Let's not even talk about it from a human standpoint for a moment. Let's talk about it strictly from the point of God. How important is it? Yeah, it's vital. Okay? An entire nation, not just a small group of people, an entire nation had been led down the wrong path because of leadership that was not feeding the flock and educating the flock and maintaining the flock in such a way that they would continue to stay steadfast in relationship to God. Are the individual people still responsible for their own actions? Yes, okay? Though he's pronouncing a woe, they're still individually and personally responsible. That doesn't change. But there's a heavy burden that's placed upon those who led the people away from what God had desired. Go ahead, Roger. Right. And not only were, and that's the twofold responsibility here. You had leadership, shepherds, who were feeding the flock the wrong thing. They were feeding them idolatry and Baal worship and those types of things. But the sad reality on the other side of that is the fact that the people didn't realize what? Or were unwilling to admit what? That they shouldn't be consuming it. Okay, this is what our shepherds are trying to feed us, but so they have a certain responsibility because of that. Then on the other side of it, here are the people who should have realized this isn't what God would want us to be fed. This isn't the food, the spiritual food that God intended for His people. Why are we consuming all of this idolatry? So, though there's responsibility on both sides, in the moment, though, who is He really hitting? He's hitting the shepherds pretty hard. In particular, because you have scattered my flock, you've driven them away. You have not what? You've not visited them. Behold, I will visit upon you the evil of your doings, saith Jehovah. The sheep had scattered, and what did the shepherds fail to do? Pursue them. Yeah, they had failed to pursue. The sheep had been scattered away, and the text, and I believe that's kind of what he's saying when he says visiting them. I don't think he's just meaning stop by for a cup of coffee. What I believe the driving at there is the sheep had been scattered, and the shepherd stood by and watched that scattering. Yeah, without concern. And the danger of that kind of leadership is that if the sheep don't recognize the concern from the shepherd, then why should they care? Why should the sheep care about spiritual things if they get the impression that the shepherds don't care either? And that's kind of this mixed problem that the nation was having. Now, were their shepherds and present-day local congregational shepherds different in some ways? Yeah, they were different in some ways in the way they're appointed, in the manner in which some of their responsibilities were given. But generically, the words and terminology are the same. You look at what is he saying? He's saying shepherds. He's talking about the food that they were feeding. In the New Testament, what does the Bible say about shepherds? Feed the flock of God. It's the principles are the same. Shepherds in that language and terminology help illustrate what elders are supposed to be doing. So there is a difference in certain details about what's happening in the days of Jeremiah, but the base principles haven't changed about what it is to shepherd and what it is to care about the people and to be cautious about not scattering the people and what you do if they are scattered. And all of that conversation is necessary within this. Roger and I are going to share the class today. Sure. Variations. Yeah. And he picked an analogy by using sheep and shepherds that helps illustrate the fact that sheep are extremely vulnerable because of their willingness to be led. They're unwilling and many times to be driven, but there is a willingness to be led. And once the sheep become familiar with the voice of the shepherd, and so here are these shepherds, these leaders among the nation of Judah, and the people had grown familiar with their voice, and so after a period of time, they've heard that voice so often that they're making assumptions. Well, if that's where the voice of the shepherd is taking me, that's where I ought to go. And so there is a great challenge that's happening here with them. Go ahead. Yeah. And Jim, there's a fine line sometimes between a willingness to be led and a willingness to be led astray. And that sometimes is kind of hard to balance. To be willing to be led. Because here's the problem sometimes. What happens is we take that notion, which is true. I can't allow myself to be led astray, so I almost take a disposition I'm unwilling to be led, period. And so it's an interesting line that you walk with a willingness to submit, because that's what sheep need to do with the shepherd, a willingness to submit and be led without being blind when that leadership is taking you in a direction God would not. Yeah. And so that's kind of what's happening among the people there. Good, Bob. There's being led astray isn't always a conscious choice to walk in a certain path, as it can at times simply be just an unwillingness to speak truth in a particular moment when truth is not being where people are being led. Go ahead. I mean, the prophecies seem to be very specific to Judah. And so I don't know how, if I'm going to include somebody else in the conversation, I'd have to see a reason to do that, if you understand what I'm saying, textually. But obviously there is going to be a permission, if you will, for eventually for anybody from that lineage to eventually come back to the homeland. And so the specifics of this moment are talking about those who have been led into Babylonian captivity from Judah, and they're going to be allowed to come home again. Certainly there's going to be remnants, who knows from where, that might eventually make their way back. Yeah. So what would God do? That was the question out of verse 3. What would God do in the future for them? Okay. So He's going to gather a remnant and allow them eventually to return. So, though He speaks through Jeremiah about tremendous calamity and sorrow that's coming in terms of the judgment of God, but he includes in that message, though, this is not what? Not the end. It's not permanent. Okay, I'm going to allow for a remnant. But even then within that breath, He's also going to say, but listen, continue to fail me and I can destroy you forever. If that's what I choose to do, don't, one minute here's the judgment, the next minute, okay, there can be a remnant and you'll be allowed to come back. And then the next breath He says, but don't allow that to convince yourselves that everything's fine. You can disobey me again, and I can bring all this to naught. Throughout it all, God wants them to understand that He has control, that His power is in control of this circumstance. And if He wants to bring Babylon for 70 or 170 years, He can do that. If He wants to allow for a remnant or not allow for a remnant, He can do that. That He is in control of all of these things. So verse 4 then tells us about what the role of the shepherd would be. I will set up shepherds over them who shall feed them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, and neither shall any be lacking, saith Jehovah. So He said, I had failed leadership that caused this problem, but in verse 4, what's He say about when this remnant comes back? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to establish shepherds who will actually feed the flock in the right way, He said. And no more will you need to be afraid that you're being fed the wrong diet. No more will you need to be dismayed and frustrated and confused because the leadership's not guiding you in the right direction. God recognized that if the remnant was going to be what He desired, it had to come from the top down. That He was going to require better leadership in order for this to work. And so He's going to reestablish shepherds who will lead in the right directions. Yeah. Yeah. They created some of their own challenges. if they had remained faithful to what God had designed to begin with, leadership that came from the judges, then certainly there could have been a different outcome here. But their desire to look like the other nations created a whole another set of problems for them. Yeah. Sure, I mean, he's been pretty heavy. This has been a pretty heavy message. And so throughout it all, then now Jeremiah is at least hearing what the future may look like for the people. By what name were they going to be called in verse 6? He said, "In his days Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely. And this is his name whereby he shall be called Jehovah our righteousness." Who's going to be king? Okay, Jesus eventually, but who's noted here in verse 6? Yeah, Jehovah our righteousness. It just depends on which translation you're reading from, by the way. But the point is, God's going to be put back where He belongs. That I believe is the point they're making. I don't know that this is a prophetic text pointing to Jesus. I think this is more so when you come back as a remnant, your leadership is going to be returned to Jehovah, who is righteous. And you are going to have a ruler over you who is God, and not men. Did they ever have a king again? In the same fashion that they had before? No. Okay, their leadership in terms of governmental was always appointed by some other government from the time that they returned. They weren't going to have the same kind of governmental system they had prior to this moment. And God says that's by design, because it's time for you when you return back to Jehovah. And so Yeah, something that God is doing. Absolutely. Well, and there could be, ultimately Jesus will reign. But He won't reign over that remnant that comes back immediately. No, I'm not. Yeah, I'm agreeing with you that there is, and I maybe overstated what I was trying to say earlier, that there's not any messianic thought here. What I'm saying is there's two thoughts. There's a great day coming where Jesus will reign. There's also the thought of when they return, Jehovah must reign. No longer under those shepherds and guidance that they had prior, and then obviously in His days Judah shall be saved. So you've got some point to the future as well there. There's a dual thought that I see here. Sometimes you get tripped in your own words. Any other thoughts? Welcome back, Tom, by the way. Well, I think that I think he's saying there, Tom, is that everybody got driven away. Everybody went taken captive, and so that even including the remnant. I think this is a direct statement from God that Jeremiah is quoting. So God did the driving, and in some ways you could Jeremiah's the messenger, so they may look at like he's doing the driving. But I think he's just quoting God, and for lack of a better way to describe that. Yeah. Notice verses 7 and 8. We talked about this in an earlier study, but when they referenced themselves prior, he said that people would point back to what moment in history? Exodus from Egypt. But he says, as Jehovah liveth, who brought up and who led the seed, verse 8, of the house of Israel out of the north country, and from all the countries whither I had driven them, and they shall dwell in their own land. Concerning the prophets, my heart within me is broken, Jeremiah says, in all the challenges. It used to be that was going to be the reference point. This now will become the new reference point in relationship to God's people, which is why I want to make sure that I keep a connection to that remnant that's coming back from captivity and not just point it all as something that is going to happen in the days of Jesus, because there is connection here to what's going to happen when they return. And this will become the new timetabled reference point for them when they were led out of the north country, out of Babylon, and that captivity. But why was his heart broken? That's one of your questions. Okay. Yeah. Because of all the false prophets who caused much of this challenge. And the land had become, notice the language, let me take you back for a minute. Notice verse 10. For the land is full of adulterers, for because of swearing the land mourneth. The pastures of the wilderness are dried up, and their course is evil, and their might is not right. When Jeremiah looked out and saw the sins of the nation, it broke his heart. Which should have been the reaction of who? Those shepherds that he talked about the first 3 verses. When the people become scattered and they become evil and they become dedicated to things that are not righteous and faithful in relationship to God, it should have broke those shepherds' heart, but it didn't break their heart. They were the cause and the catalyst behind that. Jeremiah says, it broke my heart to see prophets who were telling people things that were not true and not righteous. Yeah. Yeah. We've got to maintain our own understanding and efforts to understand the Scriptures to avoid what happened to Judah. What had become to both prophet and priest? Okay. Yeah, he said in verse 11, he said they had become profane. Which means what? What's profane mean? Evil, okay? All right. And they had become empty. They had become a profane group of leaders who were speaking to the house of God in empty ways, making empty promises, telling things contrary to what God had said. Both the prophet and priest, he says, are profane and doing it where? It's interesting description. In my house have I found their wickedness, saith Jehovah. It may have kind of dual connotation. It may have temple connotation as well as house, meaning his family, the people. But the idea here is that they unashamedly would say things contrary to what God had said. They, without hesitation or without concern, would teach and say things that were not at all what God would have desired for them to teach and to say. And so verse 15 tells us what's going to happen to them. What are they going to be fed? Okay. You're going to be fed, does anybody even know what that is? What's wormwood? Yeah. Yeah. And so here's the word they're trying to drive at. That concept of you're going to eat the bitterness of what you have created, you're going to have to consume. And I'll make them eat wormwood and drink water of gall or poison, he said in the text. This is not a scene that they should look forward to, but they're going to reap the consequences of their choices. You fed the people poison. You fed the people bitterness of sin. You led them in ways that were not accurate according to God's will. You're going to have to consume that as a result. Yeah, it sounds possible. Yeah, it didn't jump out at me. Right, yeah. If it's a direct relationship to hemlock, then it's poison just within itself, without even being symbolic. But I'd have to look, Bob. I'm not sure. Yeah, must be some more of a symbolic nature than. Yeah, yeah. 8:11. Okay. So symbolic nature, though, not something that actually occurred. So where did these folks in verse 16 get their message from? Okay, that's the problem. They teach you vanity. They speak a vision of their own heart, and not out of the mouth of Jehovah. Once you speak a message that comes from your own heart, rather than from the heart of God or the mind of God, you've already headed down the wrong path. And generally people tell you a message out of their own heart instead of what God has said because they don't what? They don't like what God has said. Okay? One of the great faith tools that we have to employ as believers is that we have to remind ourselves. The New Testament writer said it this way. He said, and God's laws are not grievous. That we have to get a mindset about us that God's will and purpose and law and instructions are always good for me. Whatever it is that He said is to my benefit. And get out of a mindset that gets frustrated or disappointed or upset with God because what He has said is not germane to what I would like to do in a particular circumstance. They didn't like what God had said, so their inclination was do whatever their own heart said. Do whatever their own mindset said. Paul said something similar about his Jewish brethren in New Testament times. Remember, he said they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge, right? They didn't, and because of that, they established their own knowledge. The Bible teaches us in Romans chapter 10, I believe. And so here's this challenge where when people don't want to embrace what the mind of God has revealed, they will attempt to establish their own thought processes about something and use their own heart to make those determinations. Yeah, that's one of the great challenges here, is that every time Jeremiah spoke, there were 3 other prophets saying, no, that's not true. And it created quite a confusing message. Notice verse 17 in that thought. They say continually unto them that despise me, Jehovah hath said, ye shall have peace. And unto every one that walketh in the stubbornness of his own heart, they say, no evil shall come upon you. Now, this may be a speculative kind of question, but I can't help but wonder in my own mind, why would they do that? What purpose? Because, there's this weird reality. Did they know they were telling people things that weren't true? Either you got to be completely delusional, right? or you have to know when you're telling the people peace and Jeremiah is telling them destruction, you either have to be completely delusional or willing to perpetrate lies without hesitation. Because the truth of the matter is, in your own heart, you know that God didn't tell you to say those things. That God didn't inform you of those things. You're saying things contrary. And it's always been amazing to me how these prophets and leaders and shepherds were willing to continue to walk a path and continue to inform people of information and thoughts that in their hearts and minds they had to have known wasn't true. And then I think to myself, to what benefit did they think they were going to gain? And the only thing I could figure is they have reached a point where they legitimately believe in Baal. They have disregarded Jehovah. They've gotten to a point where they have no concern over what Jehovah is saying through Jeremiah because they have completely given their hearts over to something completely different. And so, what's it matter if I say, no, it's all okay? But it's just one of those facets that's always kind of challenged me in a way to wonder why they would do that. Yeah. Right. And you get it, and Roger, you get it from the people's standpoint. But these guys should have known better and did know better. Yeah. And that's the part. Shepherds, then or now, get frustrated when people who should know better act in certain ways. Who they should know. They do know. They've been taught. They've been instructed. They've been given guidance. They do know better. And it's frustrating to shepherds when they see individuals who ought to be conducting themselves in the right paths and know better, don't do better. Now, throw that one extra level. How frustrating it must be for God when His shepherds and His prophets and His priests, who should know better, are conducting themselves in this fashion. It's just an interesting dynamic of this whole history. Yeah. Right. The challenge here, Ed, of failed leadership and failed sheep failing in this circumstance, it all comes back to that mechanism of people who would rather defend what they've concluded in their own heart than they would to embrace truth. And that problem has never gone away. And it's around, it's in the church, it's in the world, it's everywhere, where people are more committed to defending what they've concluded about something, even if truth is slapping them in the face every day. And that's kind of where they are. That's kind of where we find ourselves sometimes. And it puts you in an awkward position. When you'd think, when you're trying to defend something that is indefensible from Scripture, and yet people try to do it all the time. Yeah. Yeah, they're willing to risk it. Yeah, they're willing to risk it. Yeah. Everything's okay. Yeah. 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 It is amazing what people are willing to do once they've been convinced of something in their heart, irregardless of how they became convinced of it. And that's kind of the situation you're dealing with here with Jeremiah. It all came, verse 18, because they wouldn't notice, perceive, and hear His word. And what's coming according to verse 20? The anger of Jehovah shall not return until He have executed, until He have performed the intents of His heart. In the latter days ye shall understand it perfectly. We call that what? We say hindsight is 2020. He says you don't want to listen now. That's your choice. You've ignored the words. Jeremiah has told you what's coming. You've been warned. All the information's been offered. He said there's going to come a day when you're going to look back, and what are you going to say? We should have listened. Yeah. Yeah. Big mistake. And so that's kind of what's coming to them. They're going to have one of those I should have known better moments when they look back at this history. In verse 23 and 24, he talks about the hand of God and that it's not afar off, and that basically meaning what? God can reach anywhere, anytime, anybody. You can't limit the power of God. He can hide Himself in secret places, or can any hide himself in secret places so that God can't see him? Do not I fill heaven and earth, saith Jehovah. And then there's a question that comes. I'm just running through this briefly because there weren't any questions about it in your worksheets. But he said in verse 26, how long shall this be in the heart of the prophets that prophesy lies, even the prophets of the deceit of their own heart? How much longer can this go on? These perpetuating of lies and challenges that they were presenting to the people. So back to the questions then. What were these teachers trying to get the people to do in verse 27? Yeah. If I'm going to win this argument, if I'm going to continue to convince them to follow me, I've got to get them to forget about Jehovah and God. Because they keep thinking about Him, I'm going to lose my influence and power, because they'll begin to realize. And so the best way to get people to quit doing the things that God wants them to do is just to remove Him from the equation. And that's the systematic approach they're taking. Yeah, and it doesn't sound all that different, does it, from the things that are happening in our world and have been happening among men forever. In verse 30, what were the prophets doing? Which prophets was against God, or was God against, I should say? Yeah, they were stealing words. Okay, they weren't content. They weren't content to just kind of do their own thing, but they didn't even want people to hear what God was trying to educate them in. They were stealing away the words of God and would lie. Verses 31, they would lie about what God had been teaching and saying. And an oracle comes. Let me finish this real quick. An oracle came, and what was it? What word weren't they basically allowed to say anymore? That may have been a tricky question for you. Yeah. Well, the question was, what is an oracle of the Lord? I kind of took him to mean that question, not define the word oracle. I took that to mean there was an oracle He gave. What was it? You're not allowed to say what anymore. Did you see this? It's entire at that whole last section. He said, quit saying this. He said, quit saying the burden of Jehovah, the burden of Jehovah. He made a law. God made an oracle. He gave them an oracle. And He says, quit saying the burden of the Lord. me find verse 33. This people or the prophet or a priest shall ask thee, saying, What is the burden of Jehovah? Then shalt thou say unto them, What burden? I will cast you off, saith Jehovah. The prophet and the priest and the people that shall say, The burden of Jehovah, I will even punish that man and his house. I could have misread the question, but I didn't think he was just asking us to define the word oracle. I think that's what he was looking for. God had gotten tired of the people acting like His law was a burden, and people saying, well, what's God really going to do? What burden's He going to bring? So He says, I'm going to punish you. You keep saying that, I'm going to punish you for it. And He just keeps mentioning that really throughout. Notice it brings it up again in verse 36. The burden of Jehovah shall be mentioned no more. Quit it. Quit it, He says. And that conversation just continues through the rest of the chapter. All right, Lord willing then, we'll come back Wednesday evening. And 24 is a short chapter, so work on 24 and 25 for Wednesday night. 24 and 25 for Wednesday night.